Have you ever wondered what the exact sound of your life starting to unravel is? For me, it wasn't a loud crash or a dramatic explosion. It was a silent, almost imperceptible vibration on a polished mahogany table. It was the quiet hum of a cell phone that nobody else in the room even noticed. But for me, it was a seismic event, the first tremor of an earthquake that was about to bring my entire world crashing down. And the most terrifying part, it happened while I was standing in front of the one person who held my entire career in the palm of his hand. The air in the Henderson Corp boardroom was always kept at a precise 68 degrees cold enough to keep you alert. That day, it felt like absolute zero. I stood at the head of the table, my voice steady, my posture confident. I was Chloe Mitchell, the rising star of the marketing department, and this presentation was my masterpiece. It was a culmination of 3 months of sleepless nights, endless coffee, and a relentless drive to prove myself. On the screen behind me were charts and projections, a beautiful landscape of data that I knew like the back of my hand. My audience was a panel of senior executives, but my focus was entirely on one man, Mr. Henderson. He sat directly opposite me, his face an unreadable mask of calm neutrality. He was a legend in the industry, a man who could make or break a career with a single quiet word. And today, I was determined to earn his approval. I was in the middle of explaining our projected Q4 engagement metrics, my voice echoing slightly in the silent room. By leveraging a multi-platform approach, we don't just anticipate growth. I said, making eye contact with each executive, we guarantee a minimum 15% increase in market penetration. The words felt good, solid. I was in my element, a conductor leading an orchestra of my own design. It was in that precise moment of peak confidence that it happened. My phone, which I had carefully placed face down on the table, gave a single soft buzz. Normally, I would have ignored it. It was a cardinal sin to be distracted in a meeting with Henderson, but a strange primal instinct made my eyes flicker down for a nanosecond. The screen was lit up with a notification banner from my banking app. My heart stopped. It wasn't the text itself that shocked me at first, but the 2 words in the header printed in a terrifying clinical red fraud alert. My brain struggled to process the rest of the message as my mouth continued to move on autopilot. This strategic pivot ensures. What did it ensure? I couldn't remember. The words on the small screen were burning themselves into my retina. A $750 transaction at Global Poker Online was declined. Global Poker Online. I had never gambled a day in my life. The very idea was absurd. But the second line of the notification hit me with the force of a physical blow. Reason for decline, insufficient funds. Insufficient funds. The words echoed in the sudden deafening silence of my mind. How could that be possible? I was meticulous with my finances. I tracked every single dollar. I had a plan, a budget, a dream of buying my own home that I was slowly, painstakingly working toward. The idea of not having enough money to cover a fraudulent charge, let alone a legitimate one, was a failure I couldn't comprehend. A small cough brought me back to reality. It was Mr. Henderson. His eyes, which had been impassively observing the screen behind me, were now fixed directly on my face. He had a look of sharp, analytical curiosity, the kind a biologist might give a specimen that was behaving unexpectedly. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The slight tilt of his head told me everything I needed to know. He had seen me falter. He had noticed the crack in my carefully constructed facade of competence. My own face felt hot, a flush of shame and panic rising from my chest. I quickly looked back at my presentation, desperately trying to find my place. The words on the screen seemed to swim in front of my eyes. My professional triumph of just a moment ago had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. I managed to finish the last few slides, my voice sounding distant and hollow, even to my own ears. I answered the executive's questions mechanically, my brain running on a frantic parallel track, replaying those horrifying words over and over. Fraud alert, Global Poker Online, insufficient funds. When the meeting was finally over and the executives filed out with polite nods, I stood frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. The room was empty, but I felt more exposed than ever. The vibration had stopped, but the shockwave it sent through my life had just begun. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this was not some random banking error. This was a message, and I had a terrible sinking feeling that I knew exactly who had sent it. The short walk from the main house to the guest house felt like crossing a hostile border. My little cottage, once a symbol of my independence and my patient savings plan, now felt like a gilded cage. It was still my parents' property, still under their control, a constant reminder that I wasn't truly free. I dropped my briefcase by the door, the sound echoing in the small space. The first thing I did was flip open my laptop. I had to see the damage for myself. The numbers on the screen confirmed my worst fears. My checking account was practically empty. The small buffer I always kept for emergencies was gone, wiped out by a series of small, insidious transactions that all led back to one person. My savings account, the one labeled Future Home, was untouched, a sacred vault I refused to let him breach. But seeing the other account so depleted made my stomach churn with a familiar mix of anger and helplessness. I spent an hour tracing the digital breadcrumbs, the late-night food deliveries, the online subscriptions, the gaming purchases. Each one was a small betrayal, a casual theft disguised as a sibling's entitlement. When I finally walked into the main house for dinner, the smell of my mom's pot roast, usually a source of comfort, felt cloying and heavy. The three of them were already at the table. My mother Karen was fussing over my brother Ryan, refilling his glass as if he were a visiting dignitary. My father Frank was at the head of the table, stone-faced, reading the news on his tablet. Ryan was holding court, his voice loud and animated. He was bragging about the front row tickets he'd just bought for some music festival. "It was a total splurge," he said, laughing. "But you only live once, right?" He looked so carefree, so completely unburdened. The sight of it, knowing what I knew, made the anger in my chest burn white hot. I sat down quietly, the plate of food my mother placed in front of me looking tasteless. I waited for a pause in his monologue, a small opening. When it came, I acted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply took my phone, unlocked it to the banking notification from that afternoon, and placed it face up on the table next to his plate. The red letters of the fraud alert seemed to glow in the warm light of the dining room. "Ryan," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "We need to talk about this. This is the third time this month." His laughter died in his throat. He glanced at the phone, then quickly looked away, a flicker of panic in his eyes, before it was replaced by a look of annoyed indignation. "What are you talking about?" he scoffed, pushing the phone away. "That's probably just a system glitch. The bank's app is always messing up." He tried to change the subject, asking my dad about his day, but I didn't let him. "It's not a glitch, Ryan. It's a $750 charge for an online poker site." He refused to meet my eyes, focusing instead on cutting his pot roast with meticulous care. "I don't know anything about that," he muttered. "Someone must have stolen your card info. You should be more careful, Chloe." The casual way he shifted the blame, the way he tried to make it my fault, was the final straw. He wasn't just irresponsible, he was a coward. Before I could respond, my mother swooped in, her voice a syrupy balm of denial. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said, snatching my phone off the table as if it were contaminated. "Let's not ruin a perfectly good dinner with all this negativity." She turned to me, her expression a carefully crafted mask of concern. "Chloe, honey, don't be so hard on him. Ryan is just trying to find his way. He's under a lot of pressure." She patted Ryan's arm affectionately, and he gave her a weak, grateful smile. He was a 24-year-old man, and my mother was still treating him like a lost child who needed protecting from the big bad world, a world where actions had consequences. Her intervention was so predictable, so practiced. It was the family routine. Ryan messes up, and my mother smooths it over, insisting we all pretend nothing happened for the sake of keeping the peace. It was a peace that was costing me my sanity and my savings. That's when my father made his presence known. He didn't yell, not at first. He simply placed his fork and knife down on his plate with a loud, deliberate clatter that made us all flinch. The sound cut through my mother's placating words and hung in the air like a threat. "Karen's right. he said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at my mother or Ryan. His cold, hard gaze was fixed directly on me. "You're making a good living, Chloe. You have a great job, a high salary. What's the big deal about helping your brother out a little?" Every word was a carefully aimed dart. He wasn't asking a question, he was passing a judgment. "Family is supposed to support each other," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "That's what families do. They stick together. Why do you have to be so calculating about every single penny?" Calculating. The word hit me harder than if he had screamed. It painted me as the villain, the cold, unfeeling daughter who valued money more than her own brother. I looked around the table, and for the first time, I saw the situation with perfect, terrifying clarity. I saw my brother hiding behind my mother's protection. I saw my mother desperate to avoid any conflict, willing to sacrifice my well-being for the illusion of a happy family. And I saw my father, the judge and jury, who had already declared me selfish and guilty. I was completely and utterly alone, an outsider at my own family's table. His words weren't a suggestion. They were a command, an order to continue funding my brother's failures, to keep quiet, and to accept my role as the family ATM. I picked up my fork, but I didn't eat. The food had turned to ash in my mouth. There was nothing I could say that they would ever understand. I was trapped. So I did the only thing I could. I fell silent. The rest of the workday passed in a blur of forced productivity. I sat at my desk staring at spreadsheets and marketing copy, but the words and numbers were meaningless. My mind was a chaotic loop of Mr. Henderson's disappointed gaze and the sickening red glow of that fraud alert. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, a one-time slip-up from Ryan that I could contain. I tried to bury the anger and focus on the work I needed to do to salvage my reputation. But a dark, heavy feeling had settled in my stomach, a premonition that the morning's disaster was not the end, but the beginning of something much worse. It was around 3 in the afternoon when my phone rang again. It was an unknown number with a Virginia area code. Normally I would have sent it straight to voicemail, but some gut instinct told me to answer. "Hello," I said, my voice cautious. The voice on the other end was male, professional, and unnervingly calm. "Hello, am I speaking with Chloe Mitchell?" he asked. "This is she." I confirmed, a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. "My name is David Chen, and I'm calling from the Application Fraud Prevention Department at Capital One. I'm calling to verify some information regarding a recent credit card application made in your name." I felt a wave of confusion. Capital One, I didn't have any accounts with them. My credit cards were with Chase and American Express accounts I managed with obsessive care. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, already preparing to hang up. "I haven't applied for any new credit cards." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by the soft clicking of a keyboard. "I understand, ma'am," David said, his tone still perfectly even. "That's actually why I'm calling. The application submitted had a few red flags that our system caught, so we're just doing our due diligence to confirm the details with you." A cold feeling started to creep up my spine. "What kind of red flags?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, for one, the application requested a $20,000 credit limit and an immediate cash advance of $5,000, he explained. "That's a bit unusual for a brand new account. Before we proceed, could I just verify some of the information we have on file? Can you confirm your current mailing address?" He read out my parents' address, the very place I was trying so hard to escape. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That's the address." He continued, his voice a calm, methodical drone that was slowly dismantling my world. "And your date of birth?" He read out the correct date, a day I no longer felt like celebrating. "And finally, can you confirm the last 4 digits of your social security number?" He read the 4 numbers, and the floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. They were correct. Of course they were correct. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with brutal force. The constant need for money, the small thefts from my bank account, the gambling charges. It was all connected. This wasn't just about Ryan being irresponsible and reckless anymore. This was a calculated, deliberate act of theft on a scale I couldn't have imagined. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my name, my history, my future. He had taken the very numbers that defined my identity in the modern world and used them for his own selfish gain. The trust I had tried so hard to maintain, the tiny sliver of hope that he would eventually grow up, all of it disintegrated into dust. The employee, David, was still talking. "Ma'am, are you still there? Can you confirm those details?" My shock and horror began to recede, replaced by something else, something cold and hard and sharp. It was rage, a pure, undiluted rage that burned away all the confusion and hurt. I finally understood. My brother didn't see me as his sister. He saw me as a resource, a line of credit with a heartbeat. My parents didn't see me as their daughter. They saw me as a safety net, a solution to the problems they refused to solve themselves. My voice, when I finally found it, was unrecognizable. It was devoid of all emotion, as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "I did not make that application," I said. "My identity has been stolen. I want you to freeze that application immediately. I want you to flag my entire profile. I am officially reporting a case of identity theft." There was a moment of surprised silence on the other end of the line, and then the agent's professional demeanor kicked back in. "Of course, Ms. Mitchell. I am freezing the application as we speak. I will also send you a full identity theft report packet with the next steps you need to take." I listened as he gave me the instructions, but I was barely hearing him. I was looking out my office window at the city below, but I wasn't seeing it. I was seeing the long, difficult road ahead, a road I now knew I would have to walk completely alone. I don't remember the drive home. I'm sure I stopped at red lights and used my turn signals, but my body was on autopilot, while my mind was a raging inferno. The professional calm I had maintained on the phone with the bank agent had shattered the second I hung up, leaving behind a raw, visceral fury. He had used my social security number. It was a line that should never be crossed, a fundamental violation of trust that felt almost physical, like he had reached inside me and stolen something essential. This wasn't a kid making a mistake. This was a thief. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw him through the living room window. Ryan was sprawled on the couch, feet up on the coffee table, playing a video game on the large-screen TV my parents had bought him. The sound of explosions and gunfire echoed faintly through the glass. He was completely at ease, lost in his digital world without a single care. The sight of his casual comfort, his blissful ignorance of the bomb he had just detonated in my life, was so profoundly insulting that it solidified my anger into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. I was done making excuses for him. I was done letting my parents clean up his messes. This ended now. I walked into the house without a word, my heels clicking loudly on the hardwood floor. I walked straight to the television and shut it off, plunging the room into sudden silence. Ryan looked up, his face a mask of annoyance. "Hey, I was in the middle of a game," he complained, his eyes still glued to the now blank screen. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and tight. "Now." He finally turned to look at me, and seeing the expression on my face, his own shifted from irritation to a cautious defensiveness. He sat up, swinging his feet off the table. "What's your problem?" he asked. I didn't waste any time. "You used my social security number to apply for a credit card, Ryan." The accusation hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. His reaction was immediate and predictable. He started to lie. "What? No way," he said, shaking his head and trying to produce a convincing laugh. "That's crazy. Why would I do that?" He tried to look offended, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. They darted around the room looking for an escape. "I wouldn't even know how to do that," he added, the lie sounding flimsy even to him. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice dropping even lower. "I just got off the phone with David Chen from the Capital One Fraud Department. They have the application. They have my name, my address, my date of birth, and my social, all of it." The mention of a specific name, a specific department, made his defenses crumble. The color drained from his face. He knew he was caught. He slumped back into the couch cushions, the fight going out of him. For a single fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of shame in his eyes, a glimmer of the little brother I used to know, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something far uglier. He sighed a deep, put-upon sound, as if I were the one inconveniencing him. He shrugged his shoulders, a gesture of such profound indifference that it took my breath away. "Okay, fine. he admitted, his voice casual. So I applied for a card. It's not a big deal. He looked at me, then a defiant smirk playing on his lips. I was just going to borrow your credit score for a little while. Mine's not great right now. I was going to pay it all back. What are you so stressed out about? Borrow my credit score. The phrase was so absurd, so twisted in its logic, that I could only stare at him in stunned silence. He said it as if he were asking to borrow a sweater. He didn't see the years of hard work, the discipline, the sacrifices I had made to build that score. He didn't see the late nights at the office, the budgets I followed religiously, the dream of a future I was carefully constructing, one responsible decision at a time. All he saw was a resource he could tap into, an asset that belonged to him simply because we shared the same parents. There was no remorse in his voice. There was no apology in his eyes. There was only the raw, unapologetic entitlement of a child who had never been told no, who truly believed the world and everything in it was his for the taking. The silence stretched on as I looked at the stranger sitting on my parents' couch, a man who wore my brother's face, and in that silence, I finally understood. He would never change because he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. In his mind, I was the one who was out of line. I was the one who was making a big deal out of nothing. Our raised voices had carried through the house, and soon my parents appeared in the doorway of the living room, their faces etched with concern. My mother, Karen, immediately sized up the situation, her eyes darting from my furious face to Ryan's defiant pout. As always, her instincts took over. She rushed to Ryan's side, placing a protective hand on his shoulder, as if I were a physical threat. "What's going on here?" she asked, though it was obvious she already knew. "Ryan, what did you do?" Before he could answer, I did. "He committed a felony, Mom. He stole my identity." My mother flinched at the harshness of the words, then her expression softened into one of exasperation, aimed not at Ryan, but at me. "Oh, Chloe, don't be so dramatic," she sighed, stroking Ryan's hair. "I'm sure he just made a foolish mistake. He's your brother. We can handle this as a family quietly." She was already spinning the narrative, recasting a federal crime as a silly sibling squabble. She was building a wall of excuses around him brick by brick, just as she always had. My father, Frank, had been silent until then, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression hardening as he listened. His anger, however, was also completely misdirected. "Quietly is right," he boomed, taking a step forward. "What were you thinking calling the bank? Are you trying to embarrass this family? You don't air our dirty laundry out for the whole world to see." He was looking at me with pure disappointment, as if my act of self-preservation was a betrayal of some sacred family code. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "You always have to make a big deal out of everything. You're going to call that man back, cancel the report, and we will deal with Ryan ourselves." I looked at the three of them, a united front. My mother, the enabler, my father, the enforcer, and my brother, the black hole of irresponsibility they both orbited. They stood there ready to absorb this crisis, repackage it as my fault, and demand that I fix it. They expected me to back down. They expected me to obey. They expected me to sacrifice myself on the altar of their dysfunctional peace. But the woman who had walked into this house 15 minutes ago was gone. In her place was someone who finally understood that she had no family here. Not really. Words were useless against their wall of denial. Arguing was pointless. So I chose the only language they would understand: action. I looked from my father's furious face to my mother's pleading eyes to my brother's smug expression. Then, without saying another word, I pulled out my phone. I saw a flicker of relief on my father's face. He thought I was obeying calling the bank to retract my statement. I navigated to my recent calls and found the number for David Chen. I pressed the call button, and then I pressed the speakerphone icon. The robotic voice of the Capital One directory filled the tense silence of the room. "Thank you for calling. Please listen carefully as our menu options have recently changed." My mother's eyes widened. My father's face darkened with confusion, then rage. Ryan's smirk finally faltered. I waited patiently through the prompts, and when a live agent finally answered, I spoke my voice loud, clear and steady for everyone to hear. "Hello," I said, my eyes locked on my father. My name is Chloe Mitchell. I'm calling to follow up on a fraud report I made earlier today. I need to formally file an official report for identity theft." For 2 days, a fragile, unspoken truce held the house in its grip. We moved around each other like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, the silence thick with resentment. I went to work, came home, and locked myself in the guest house, burying myself in legal forms and credit reports. I knew the silence was temporary. It was the eerie calm before a hurricane. The summons came on a Wednesday evening in the form of a text message from my father. It contained only 3 words: living room, now. There was no greeting, no explanation. It was an order, blunt and absolute. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew this was it. This was the trial I had been dreading, with my father acting as judge, jury, and executioner. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my work blouse, and walked across the yard to the main house, feeling like a prisoner on her way to sentencing. He was waiting for me seated in his large leather armchair, the throne from which he ruled our family. My mother was pacing nervously by the fireplace, wringing her hands, her face a mess of anxiety. Ryan was nowhere to be seen. Of course, he would not be present for this. This was never about holding him accountable. This was about reasserting control over me. My father didn't even look at me as I entered. He simply gestured toward the coffee table with a curt nod of his head. Lying there was a cheap, flimsy envelope with a red window, the kind that always contains bad news. It had been torn open aggressively. "Sit down," he said. It was not a request. I sat on the edge of the couch, my back straight, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. He let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, a tactic designed to make me squirm. Finally, he spoke, his voice dangerously low. "You wanted to handle things your way," he began. "You wanted to call the bank and make a big show of things. Well, congratulations. This is the result of your little drama." He picked up a letter from inside the envelope and tossed it onto the table in front of me. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right at my knees. The letterhead was from a company I had never heard of, a collection agency with a menacing logo. The words "Final Notice" were stamped across the top in bold red ink. The amount due was $10,000. "Because you froze your own credit," my father continued, his voice dripping with accusation. "Your brother had nowhere to turn. He made another stupid mistake, a desperate one, and got himself in deep with some online loan sharks. They've been calling the house non-stop, threatening legal action." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes pinning me in place. The logic was so twisted, so profoundly manipulative, it was almost impressive. In his version of reality, my act of protecting myself from a felony was the direct cause of Ryan's further failures. I was the villain who had forced my poor, innocent brother into the arms of predators. I picked up the letter, my hands steady. I read the details, my mind feeling strangely numb. It was all there. The exorbitant interest rates, the threats veiled in legal jargon. It was ugly and desperate, but it was not my problem. "You will fix this," my father said, his voice hardening into a command. "You will call this company and you will pay this debt, every single cent. Consider it an expensive lesson in what happens when you disrespect your family and refuse to listen to your father." He sat back in his chair, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He had laid out my punishment. He had delivered my sentence. In his mind, the matter was closed. There was no room for discussion. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back on the table. I looked up and met his gaze, and for the first time in my life, I felt no fear, only a profound, liberating clarity. "No," I said. The word was quiet, almost a whisper, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a gunshot. My mother gasped. My father's expression of smug authority froze, then began to curdle into disbelief. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. I said it again, louder this time, my voice clear and unwavering. "No, I will not pay it. This is Ryan's debt. He is 24 years old. He needs to face the consequences of his own actions." A dark red flush began to creep up my father's neck. He looked at me as if I were a complete stranger, an alien who had invaded his home and was speaking a language he didn't understand. He had expected me to cry, to argue, to plead. He had never in his entire life expected me to simply and calmly refuse his authority. The shock on his face quickly morphed into a terrifying rage. "I am your father," he said, his voice rising with each word. "You will do as I say." My mother rushed forward. "Frank, please, let's just calm down and talk about this." He swatted her hand away without even looking at her. "Stay out of this, Karen." He stood up from his armchair, his large frame towering over me. He was trying to intimidate me, to use his physical presence to make me feel small and powerless, just like he always had. But it didn't work anymore. "You live in my house," he snarled, his face now a deep, angry crimson. "You follow my rules. You have a responsibility to this family, a responsibility to fix the messes that you helped create." I stood up too, so that we were face to face. "My only responsibility is to myself," I said, my voice shaking slightly, but holding firm. "I will not set myself on fire to keep Ryan warm anymore." That was it. That was the final break. His face contorted with a fury so intense it was frightening. He raised his hand and slammed it down on the coffee table with a deafening crack. The sound made my mother scream. "Then you have a choice!" He bellowed, his voice hoarse with rage, spittle flying from his lips. "You either pay this debt and do what you're told, or you get out of my house. Get out!" His final words, "get out," hung in the air, vibrating with a rage so pure it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. The echo faded, replaced by a ringing silence that was somehow louder and more terrifying than his shouting. My father stood there panting slightly, his face still a mottled, angry red. His chest heaved, the victor of a battle he thought he had just won. He had finally used his ultimate weapon, the threat of casting me out, the one thing a child is supposed to fear above all else. He expected me to crumble. He expected tears pleading a desperate apology, a promise to do whatever he wanted. He expected me to fall back in line, broken and obedient. He was waiting for the storm, for the dramatic climax to this ugly scene. But the storm never came. Instead, a strange and profound calm washed over me. It was a feeling so foreign and so complete that for a moment I wondered if I was in shock. It felt as if a thick, heavy cord that had been wrapped around my chest for my entire life had just been severed with a clean, sharp snap. His ultimatum wasn't a threat. It was a release. His rage wasn't a punishment. It was a key unlocking the door to a cage I hadn't even fully realized I was in. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and I didn't see my father anymore. I saw a bully, a man whose only source of power came from intimidation and control. And I saw with heartbreaking clarity that his power over me was gone. He had played his final card, and in doing so, he had lost the game entirely. My gaze shifted to my mother. She stood frozen by the fireplace, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a familiar, terrified paralysis. She was a statue of inaction. In that moment, I saw her too, not as a mother, but as a willing accomplice to his tyranny, a woman who would always choose the path of least resistance, even if it meant sacrificing her own daughter's well-being for a few moments of fragile peace. She would not save me. She would not stand up for me. She had made her choice long ago. And in her terrified silence, I finally completely accepted mine. I was utterly and completely on my own. And the realization didn't feel lonely. It felt liberating. I took a slow, steadying breath. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting. My father's full of angry expectation. My mother's full of fearful pleading. I met my father's gaze directly, and for the first time I didn't flinch. There were no tears welling in my eyes. There was no tremor of fear in my hands. There was only a quiet, resolute emptiness. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I understand," I said. My voice was clear and steady, devoid of any emotion. It wasn't the voice of a surrendering daughter. It was the voice of a business associate acknowledging the end of a contract. In those two simple words, I said everything that needed to be said. I understand that this is not a home, but a house built on conditions. I understand that your love is a transaction, and I have just defaulted on the terms. I understand that I am not your daughter, but a resource you no longer control. I understand that you have just set me free. I stood up from the couch. My movements were not rushed or angry. They were slow, deliberate, and final. I didn't look at the letter on the table. I didn't look at my mother's stricken face. I kept my eyes on my father, who was staring at me with a look of stunned disbelief. This was not the reaction he had prepared for. He was an actor in a play, and I had just walked off the stage, leaving him alone under the harsh lights. I turned my back on him on both of them and walked toward the front door. Every step on the hardwood floor was a declaration, a step away from their control, a step away from the guilt, a step toward my own life. They remained silent, too shocked to speak. They had expected a fight, but I had given them nothing. I had simply accepted their terms, and in doing so, had taken away all of their power. I reached the door, my hand closing around the cold brass knob, and I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. The quiet click of the latch as the door closed behind me was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I drove without a destination, the quiet hum of my car, a stark contrast to the screaming chaos in my head. For the first time in my life, I had no home to go to. The guest house wasn't mine, and the main house was a war zone where I had just been declared an enemy combatant. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but my mind was adrift. There was only one place to go, one person who would understand without judgment. I found myself on the familiar route to my best friend Jess's apartment, a small but vibrant space that had always felt more like home than my own. When she opened the door, her cheerful greeting died on her lips. She took one look at my face, at the strange, numb emptiness in my eyes, and her expression shifted immediately from welcome to alarm. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just pulled me inside, wrapped me in a hug, and closed the door on the rest of the world. She sat me down on her plush sofa, draped a soft blanket over my shoulders, and pressed a warm mug of tea into my hands. She didn't push or prod. She just sat with me in the quiet, giving me the space to find the words. And when I finally started talking, it all came pouring out. It wasn't a neat chronological story. It was a torrent of frustration and hurt, a decade of resentment finally unleashed. I told her about the endless small thefts, the gaslighting, the constant pressure to be the responsible one. I told her about the identity theft, the call from the bank, and the look of utter indifference on Ryan's face. And then I told her about the final meeting, about my father's ultimatum. His face contorted in rage as he screamed at me to get out. As I spoke, Jess's expression transformed. Her initial sympathy hardened into a fierce, protective anger. She was angry for me, a righteous fury that I had never allowed myself to feel. She didn't offer platitudes or tell me it would all be okay. She validated my pain. "He's a monster, Chloe," she said, her voice low and intense. "They all are. They've been using you as a human shield for years." Her words were a balm. Hearing someone else say it, someone I trusted, made me feel less crazy, less alone. When my story was finished, leaving me feeling hollowed out and exhausted, Jess didn't miss a beat. She stood up, her entire demeanor shifting from comforter to commander. "Okay," she said, her voice firm. "Crying time is over. Now it's time to get strategic. First things first, you're staying here for as long as you need. Second, we need a plan. A real one." She pulled her laptop from the coffee table and sat down next to me, her energy infectious. "They declared war, Chloe. It's time we started fighting back." For the next hour, we weren't two friends commiserating. We were a two-woman command center mapping out a counter-offensive. Jess opened a new document and titled it Operation Freedom. We made a list, a series of concrete, actionable steps that gave my swirling panic a sense of order. First on the list was legal. "We need to consult a lawyer who specializes in identity theft and family law," Jess said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We need to know your rights." And next came the credit bureaus, Equifax, TransUnion, Experian. We bookmarked their websites, creating a plan to place a full fraud alert and freeze on my credit across all three platforms, building an impenetrable wall around my financial identity. Then came the most difficult part, the part that made my stomach clench with a mixture of terror and exhilarating defiance. The financial separation. "You need to cut every single tie," Jess said, her voice gentle but firm. "Any joint accounts, any automatic payments, everything." My mind immediately went to the single biggest tie, the one that had been a source of both pride and resentment for years. The $1,500 monthly mortgage payment. It was scheduled to come out of my account in 5 days. It was the chain that still connected me to that house, to them. Jess saw the look on my face. "You know what you have to do," she said softly. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. I took the laptop from her. My hands trembled slightly as I typed in the web address for my bank. I logged in the familiar interface of my online account appearing on the screen. It all looked so normal, so mundane, but what I was about to do felt monumental. I navigated to the bill pay section, my heart pounding in my ears. And there it was, a recurring payment scheduled for the first of every month. Payee Frank Mitchell, amount $1,500. It was a digital symbol of my obligation, my deal. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my cursor hovering over the small red button that read, "Cancel Payment." Clicking it felt like jumping off a cliff. It was terrifying, irreversible, and absolutely necessary. I thought of my father's face twisted with rage. I thought of my mother's silent complicity. I thought of Ryan's smug entitlement. I took a deep breath, and I clicked. A confirmation box popped up. "Are you sure you want to cancel this scheduled payment?" I clicked yes without a moment's hesitation. A second later, an email notification appeared at the top of my screen. The subject line was simple. "Your scheduled payment has been successfully canceled." I leaned back against the sofa, a long, shuddering breath escaping my lips. The first link in the chain had been broken. The window of opportunity I desperately needed arrived in the most mundane way possible. A few days after the ultimatum, I had to go into the main house to pick up a package that had been mistakenly delivered there. I let myself in quietly, hoping to avoid any contact. As I grabbed the box from the entryway table, I heard my mother's voice from the kitchen. She was on the phone, her tone light and social. "Oh, it will be so nice to get away," she was saying. "The wedding in San Diego is just what we need. We'll be gone from Friday morning until late Sunday night, a whole weekend to forget about all this drama." My blood ran cold. San Diego, an entire weekend. It was a gift from the universe, a 3-day head start on the rest of my life. I slipped out of the house before she could see me, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was my chance. My first call was to Jess. "They're leaving," I said, my voice a hushed, urgent whisper. "This weekend. I have to get my stuff out." Jess didn't hesitate. "I'm there," she said. "What's the plan?" We quickly realized we had a logistical problem. My small sedan wasn't going to be enough for my bed, my desk, and a life's worth of accumulated belongings. "We need a truck," Jess said, her mind already working. "And more muscle. What about Ben from your office, the guy in IT? He seems nice, and didn't you say he has an old pickup?" Ben Carter was a kind, quiet colleague who had always been friendly to me at work. Asking him for a favor this huge felt like an imposition, but desperation made me bold. I called him, my voice trembling slightly, as I explained the situation, carefully leaving out the most dramatic details. I just said I needed to move out of a bad living situation, and I had to do it quickly and quietly. He listened patiently, and when I was done, his response was simple and immediate. "Of course, Chloe, I'll help. What time on Saturday?" I almost cried with relief. I had a team, I had a plan, I had a chance. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, a perfect cloak for our secret operation. I watched from the guest house window as my parents' car pulled out of the driveway, my mother in a floral dress and my father in a stiff suit, off to celebrate someone else's happy union while ours lay in ruins. The moment their car turned the corner, I sent the text, "Coast is clear." 15 minutes later, Jess's car and Ben's rumbling pickup truck pulled silently into the driveway. They didn't come in with loud greetings. They came in like a rescue team, their faces set with a quiet determination. Jess had brought a stack of flattened cardboard boxes and rolls of packing tape. Ben brought work gloves and a dolly. They were ready. The next 4 hours were a blur of coordinated, efficient motion. We worked with a focused intensity, speaking only in hushed whispers. It was a silent ballet of liberation. The soundtrack to my escape was the screech of packing tape being pulled from its roll, the soft thud of books being placed in a box, and the scraping sound of furniture being carefully slid across the floor. I moved through the small house, stripping my life from its walls. I took down photos, packed away clothes, and dismantled the IKEA bookshelf that had taken me an entire afternoon to build. Each object held a memory, a ghost of the life I thought I was building here. There was the chipped coffee mug from a college road trip, the worn paperback copy of my favorite novel, a small framed photo of a younger, happier version of our family that I almost left behind, but ultimately tucked into a box. It was a strange and painful process, like packing away pieces of myself. While I handled the personal effects, Jess was the general directing the larger operation. She pointed to the mattress, and Ben, with a strength that surprised me, hefted it onto his shoulder. She mapped out the most efficient path to the truck, making sure we didn't scrape any walls or make any unnecessary noise. They worked together seamlessly, a well-oiled machine powered by friendship and decency. Box by box, piece by piece, the guest house grew more and more empty. The space that had been my sanctuary and my prison was slowly being erased, returned to a blank, anonymous state. The indentation in the carpet where my bed used to be, the faint square on the wall where a picture once hung, these were the only signs I had ever lived there. With every item loaded into the back of Ben's truck, I felt a little lighter, as if I were physically shedding the weight of my family's expectations. Finally, it was done. I stood in the doorway of the completely empty guest house, the silence echoing around me. It was over. Jess came and stood beside me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. Ben gave a respectful nod from the driveway, already securing the last of my belongings with bungee cords. I took one last look at the empty rooms, a silent goodbye to the person I used to be. Then I turned around, closed the door for the last time, and walked toward the truck without looking back. Ben's truck was packed, the contents of my life secured under a worn blue tarp. Jess stood by her car, giving me a supportive, questioning look. I could have just gotten in the truck and driven away, disappearing without a trace, but that felt incomplete. It felt like running. I wasn't running anymore. I needed to leave a message, not of anger or of sadness, but of fact. A clear, cold, undeniable statement that this chapter was closed and that I was the one who had closed it. "I'll be right back," I said, my voice steady. I turned away from them and walked back toward the main house one last time. The silence was absolute, the house looming like a sleeping giant. I used my key to unlock the front door, the familiar click sounding alien and final. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The air was still and smelled faintly of last night's dinner. This was the room where my father had screamed at me, where my mother had stood by and watched. The memory was no longer a fresh wound, but a scar, a permanent reminder of the moment everything changed. I walked to the dining room table, its polished surface reflecting the gray light from the windows. It was here that my family had sat in judgment of me so many times. It was here that they would sit again when they returned, expecting to find their world exactly as they had left it. They were in for a surprise. From my pocket, I took the single key to the guest house. It felt cool and heavy in my palm. I placed it carefully in the center of the table, directly where my father's plate would normally be. The small metallic sound was the only noise in the cavernous silence. It was a symbol of surrender, but not my surrender. It was me surrendering my role, my obligation, my place in their lives. Next, I unfolded the single sheet of paper I had printed at Jess's apartment. It was the email from the bank. The words were stark and impersonal, a block of corporate text confirming a digital action. Automated mortgage payment for account ending in 7392 has been successfully canceled. I smoothed the paper out and placed it directly beside the key. There was no need for a handwritten note full of accusations or explanations. This was better. This was colder. This was the simple, irrefutable truth. The key said, "I am gone." The paper said, "And so is your safety net." It was a message written in the language of consequences, the only language my father truly understood. Action, not words. I stood there for a moment looking at the two small objects on the vast empty table. It was a quiet, devastating statement. I had said my piece. I turned around, walked out the front door, and locked it behind me for the very last time. 3 weeks. It sounds like a lifetime when you're waiting for something, but for me, those 21 days passed in the blink of an eye. Living at Jess's apartment was a revelation. There was no walking on eggshells, no holding my breath every time I heard a car pull into the driveway. We ate takeout on the floor, watched terrible reality television, and talked for hours. For the first time in years, I felt my shoulders unclench from the permanent state of tension I had been living in. I was a guest in her home, yet I felt more at peace, more truly myself than I ever had in the small house that was supposed to be mine. That newfound peace bled into every other area of my life. Without the constant low-level hum of anxiety about my family, my mind was clear. I could focus. At work, I threw myself into my projects with a renewed energy that I hadn't realized was missing. The campaign I had presented on that awful morning, the one where I had nearly derailed my own career, became my singular focus. I channeled all the anger, all the frustration, all the defiant energy I was feeling into making it a spectacular success. And it was. The campaign didn't just meet its targets, it shattered them. The client was ecstatic the numbers were unprecedented, and the buzz around the office was impossible to ignore. I had proven to myself that I was more than just the family problem solver. I was good at my job. I was valuable. So when Mr. Henderson's assistant called and asked me to come to his office, a flicker of the old fear returned. I thought back to my stumble during the presentation, the look of disappointment in his eyes. I walked down the hall, my heart beating a little too fast, preparing myself for a critique. He was sitting behind his large desk, the city skyline framed perfectly in the window behind him. He gestured for me to sit. "Chloe," he began, his voice even, "I'll be direct. You faltered in that presentation a few weeks ago. You lost your focus. I noticed." I felt my face flush, ready to apologize, but he held up a hand. "But," he continued, a rare small smile touching the corner of his mouth, "whatever was distracting you that day is clearly no longer an issue. Oh, the results from the Vantage campaign are the best I have seen from this department in 5 years. They are exceptional." He leaned forward, his expression serious now. "We have a senior marketing director position opening up next month. It comes with a new team, a bigger portfolio, and a significant salary increase. I want you to take it." I was speechless. I just stared at him, the words not quite registering. Promotion, director, salary increase. It was everything I had been working toward, a goal that had felt impossibly distant just a month ago. "Thank you, sir." I finally managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. "I accept." As I walked out of his office, I felt a sense of pride so profound it almost brought me to tears. This was mine. I had earned this. My success had nothing to do with my family. It had everything to do with me. But at the exact moment I was shaking his hand, a very different scene was unfolding in the house I used to call home. The air in the Mitchell living room was thick and sour, with unsaid words and simmering resentment. Karen's hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold the letter she had just pulled from the mailbox. It was another one identical to the first, but this time the red letters at the top seemed to scream, "Second notice of overdue payment, immediate action required." She read the terrifying official language that followed. Words like delinquency, credit bureau reporting, and the one that made her feel faint, foreclosure. She sank onto the couch, the letter fluttering from her numb fingers. The system that had run her life for decades was broken. The peace she had worked so hard to maintain had shattered into a million pieces. Frank wasn't yelling anymore. The rage had burned itself out over the past 3 weeks, leaving behind the gray ash of impotence. He was pacing a lion in a cage of his own making, wearing a path in the expensive carpet his daughter's money had helped to pay for. His threats, his anger, his authority, all of it was useless now. He had no one left to command. He had banished the one person who kept their fragile world from collapsing. He stopped pacing and looked at his wife, seeing not a partner, but a reflection of his own failure. And Ryan, the architect of their ruin, the reason for the threatening letters and the sleepless nights, was nowhere to be found. He was out with friends, spending money he didn't have, blissfully unaware and unconcerned with the consequences that were now arriving at his parents' front door. Karen and Frank were alone, trapped in the suffocating silence of a future they had built together, a future that was now collapsing in on them, one overdue notice at a time. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my new office, the one with my name on the door and a window that overlooked the entire city. I was organizing my workflow for the new team I was about to lead, feeling a sense of calm, purposeful control that was still wonderfully novel. My phone buzzed on the desk, displaying an unknown number. I had blocked my parents' and brother's numbers weeks ago, but a part of me always knew they would find another way. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I knew that would only delay the inevitable. It was better to face it, to end it once and for all. I took a deep breath, letting the peaceful view from my window fortify me, and answered. "This is Chloe," I said, my voice professional and cool. For a moment, there was only the sound of ragged, frantic breathing. Then a voice I knew better than my own came spilling through the receiver, a choked, hysterical sob. "Chloe! Oh, thank God! I had to use your Aunt Carol's phone. You wouldn't answer mine." It was my mother. The sound of her voice, so full of manufactured crisis, sent an old familiar tension coiling in my stomach. I stood up and walked to the window, physically distancing myself from the voice on the phone. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, my tone flat. "What do I want?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with a mixture of tears and disbelief. "I want to know how you could do this to us." "The bank. Chloe. The bank is going to take our house. Our home. They said they're starting foreclosure proceedings. How could you let this happen?" Her words were a masterclass in manipulation, each one designed to place the blame squarely on my shoulders. It wasn't their financial irresponsibility or my brother's destructive behavior that was causing this. It was me. It was my fault for refusing to be their solution. I listened to her tirade, my eyes tracing the path of a tiny car moving along a distant highway, so far removed from the chaos she was trying to pull me back into. I waited for her to run out of breath, for her sobs to subside into sniffles. "Did you stop paying just to punish us?" she whispered, her voice now taking on a wounded, pitiful tone. "Is that it? You're tearing this family apart because your father hurt your feelings." I almost laughed. It was so perfectly, tragically them. Their inability to see their own role in this disaster was absolute. "I'm not doing anything to you, Mom," I said, my voice quiet but firm, a stark contrast to her hysteria. "I'm just not doing anything for you anymore. There's a difference." Her sobs started up again. "But we'll be homeless. Your father and I, your brother. Where are we supposed to go? You have to come home. You have to fix this." Fix this. The two words that had defined my entire existence in that family. I was the fixer, the cleaner, the one who made everything right so they could continue to make everything wrong. But the woman she was talking to wasn't that person anymore. I looked at my reflection in the glass of my office window. I saw a woman who looked tired but strong, a woman who was finally the director of her own life. "No, Mom, I'm not coming home," I said gently. "And I'm not fixing this. Do you remember what Dad said to me?" There was a confused silence on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" she finally asked. "His last words to me." I clarified my voice, holding no anger, only a simple statement of fact. "He stood in the living room and screamed at me. He told me to get out of his house, so I did. I am just doing exactly what he demanded of me." The simple truth of it seemed to stun her into silence. She had no argument for it because it was undeniable. She tried one last time, her voice a desperate, pathetic plea. "But you're his daughter. You're our daughter." I closed my eyes. "And Ryan is your son," I replied softly. "You and Dad have chosen to protect him his entire life. Now you can continue to do so. That is not my responsibility anymore." Before she could reply, before she could launch into another round of tears and blame, I said the last words I ever intended to say to her. "I wish you and Dad the best of luck with Ryan." And with that, I ended the call. I looked at the unknown number on my screen for a long moment. Then I opened my contacts, created a new entry under my aunt's name, and I blocked it. A few days after that final call, I was sitting in a sunlit corner of a bustling coffee shop. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries, a world away from the stale, suffocating atmosphere I had left behind. In front of me, on a small wooden table, was a lease agreement. The words at the top, residential lease for apartment 7B, seemed to hum with a quiet, powerful energy. I was surrounded by the gentle chatter of strangers, the clinking of ceramic mugs, the whoosh of the espresso machine. It was the beautiful, anonymous noise of a world moving forward, and for the first time I felt like I was moving with it. I picked up the pen the cheerful realtor had left for me. My hand was perfectly steady. As I signed my name on the dotted line, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of victory or of spite. It was a smile of profound, bone-deep relief. It was the smile of a woman who had finally unequivocally chosen herself. That evening I stood in a quiet hallway that smelled of fresh paint and new carpets. In my hand I held a single shiny key. This one was mine. It didn't come with conditions or obligations. It didn't unlock a cage. It unlocked a future. I slid the key into the lock of apartment 7B. The sound of the tumblers clicking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I turned the knob and pushed. The door swung open silently, revealing a clean, empty space. Sunlight from the large picture windows streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was just a simple one-bedroom apartment with beige walls and a view of the city, but to me it was a kingdom. It was a blank canvas, a quiet promise, a safe harbor. I stepped across the threshold, my footsteps echoing softly in the empty room. And as I closed the door behind me, shutting out the past for good, I knew I wasn't just stepping into a new apartment. I was stepping into my own life. A life I would build myself on my own terms, one beautiful, peaceful day at a time. True family isn't about shared blood, it's about shared respect. Setting boundaries isn't an act of cruelty, but an act of self-preservation. Sometimes the most powerful choice you can make is to walk away from a table where love is served with conditions. Your peace is worth protecting,